staggering crime statistics, but there's hope that once the Criminal Law Forensic Procedures Amendment Bill becomes law, it will be easier to trace repeat offenders. We're now joined by Vanessa Lynch, Director for DNA for Africa from Cape Town. Vanessa, thank you so much for your time this evening. So for those who aren't familiar with this new bill, what does it propose exactly?
Good evening, Hanley. The new bill essentially allows the police to take DNA samples from convicted offenders. And the reason this is important is that we have a very high rate of serial offences in South Africa, and a lot of the crimes that have been committed or the cold cases actually can be related back to prisoners. And the more we can identify these serial offenders early on in their criminal career, so to speak, the sooner that we can get that criminal population onto the DNA database. So this is a very important step in populating our database with the correct people to identify them early and prevent them from attacking again.
So while that database will be an excellent resource for the criminal justice system as a whole, we know we're sitting with an embarrassing backlog of forensic processing. How is that gap going to be bridged?
Well, fortunately, there's been a huge step up by the Forensic Science Laboratory Services and SAPS, and they have not only given funding to the forensic science laboratories, but they've also provided contracts, and they've maintained the instrumentation in order to address this backlog. They have apparently reduced it by up to 38%. They're looking at a zero backlog date by November 2022. But we mustn't forget that we are continuously receiving new cases in addition to this backlog. It's encouraging to know that they are taking steps to address the backlog, but we won't really start seeing the decrease in crime statistics, specifically with gendered violence, until we start getting hits on the database and identifying these serial offenders to stop them from attacking again.
So while the database is largely aimed at identifying those serial offenders that you're talking about, is it also likely to help us reduce crime in that it's going to up the rate of convictions?
Yes, that's an excellent question, because there's been recent studies that a DNA database not only identifies serial offenders, but it also acts as a deterrent. And this is something that we will only see once we have more profiles on the DNA database. So this is definitely all towards decreasing crime, identification of the offenders, but then we also need the cooperation of the justice system. So, you know, the delays in getting these results to the prosecutors in order for them to utilize them in court also needs to be addressed, because those delays also allow the perpetrators to continue to perpetrate crimes. So it's a very complex issue, but this is a very good step in the right direction, and many administrations throughout the world are seeing very good results with regards specifically to gendered violence, with an uptake in forensic DNA sampling and populating a forensic DNA database. And I hope that in time we will start to see the same decrease in crime statistics regarding gendered violence, the more that we decrease that backlog and up our DNA profiling in South Africa.
We've got so many victims of crime, especially gender-based violence in South Africa, victims who delayed violence, or justice delayed is justice denied almost, so they wait for years before any kind of justice is meted out, if it is meted out. This should surely be very encouraging for them, especially in cases of rape.
Absolutely. And we need more transparency. You know, we've been calling for this for a long time, just as we had a dashboard for the COVID statistics. Why can't we have a dashboard for survivors of gendered violence to understand exactly how many cases are in backlog, where their cases sit in respect of that backlog? The government need to be accountable. They need to be more transparent with regards to this in order to really put pressure and accountability with regards to closing the gap between the time that the DNA sample was collected from the survivor, the time that it's been analysed, loaded onto the DNA database and utilised in court. That gap definitely needs to be narrowed down, and the survivors need to have access to that information.
We also know that South Africa is struggling with overpopulation of its prisons, and for that reason parole is often granted, perhaps in the victim's eyes, too soon. How is this new database also going to try and alleviate the overcrowding of prisons?
I'm not sure it'll alleviate the overcrowding of prisons, but certainly what it will do is it will identify whether somebody who's being released on parole for that particular case may in fact be linked to other cases. We had a similar situation with a person who was convicted of a common assault, and when they were released, well, before they were released, their DNA profile was linked to 30 unrelated rape cases. So it is a methodology to ensure that the violent criminals, if they are identified to other cold cases, are not released and they are kept in prison. So I think from that perspective, it really is a good way of identifying our very serious violent serial offenders.
So while it's bad news for criminals, it could also be, on the flip side, good news for the innocent. We know that people are, in some instances, prosecuted for crimes they did not commit. How can the system help them?
Well, in fact, the very case I've just mentioned, prior to that, 5 people were arrested for that, for a number of those rapes, and the communities were convinced that those were the perpetrators of those crimes. And DNA, in fact, exonerated them. So DNA is a very powerful tool to not only identify but to exonerate the innocent. And actually, it's more important to ensure that innocent people are not convicted of a crime that they haven't committed. So yes, it's a very good point that it can act both ways, and it can actually be utilised, for a dual purpose.
And presumably this bill makes provision that the criminals, those convicted criminals from whom DNA samples will be collected, they can't protest or refuse to give samples.
Yes, well, that's a recent inclusion. So previously, the DNA Act, which was passed in 2015, didn't have an inclusion to say that in the event of a refusal, that the minimum force would be allowed. Because they started getting refusals initially when they had a 2-year period within which to sample prisoners, which expired, and now this new bill allows us to continue and reinstate that DNA sampling program of prisoners. There now is an additional clause which says that should the prisoner refuse, that minimal force will be allowed to be utilised in the event of a refusal. So this means that all DNA samples will be taken from prisoners, and that won't be a loophole in respect of prisoners who are refusing, and often the refusals are based on the fact that that prisoner knows that they will be linked to other cold cases.
As we've received some bad news today in terms of the crime stats, but this new bill is certainly good news for all South Africans. Thank you very much for speaking to us. Vanessa Lynch, Director for DNA for Africa, speaking to us about that new bill.